So anyway, I will let people join along the webinar. So I will just shortly remind the framework that most of the participants know already of this webinar series. It concerns the radioactive waste management and transparency and public participation in different national cases. So it's looking at early stage, but also advanced program in both large or small inventories. And the idea is to look at an overview of good and bad examples of public participation, and to enhance exchange among the civil society members. So we had already few national case presented, starting with Sweden, and then Denmark, France, and today. So we'll look at the British national case. We will have next month. We had a bit of change because today was supposed to be Greenland. So, and next month another the Czech case. So it change occurred, and next month it will be the Dutch case with Jana Verkamp. We'll then have the summer and then the Czech case in September, and the greenish case will be then in December. Okay. So in conclusion, just to remind that the aim of Nuclear Transparency Watch is to encourage and support citizens to seek national legal remedy, and to, in case it's relevant, communicate violations to the European Commission and to the Irish Convention Compliance Committee. So interesting topic will be public participation, long-term governance, and international issues. So maybe we can then start with the British national case. That will be presented today by Colin Wales from Cumbria Trust. Please, Colin.
Very, very briefly, this is a potted history of where radioactive waste management and nuclear waste disposal has got to up until 1976, until the present day. It was first identified as a problem by the Royal Commission on the Environmental Pollution, which is known as the Flowers Report. And in that, there was a commitment in Chapter 11, Paragraph 2, a recommendation that there should be no commitment to a large program of nuclear fission power until it's been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that a method exists to ensure the safe containment of long-lived, highly radioactive waste for the indefinite future. Next slide, Malcolm, please. And this is something that I wanted to include because it really shows the character of the man that wrote the report. I'll let you read it for yourselves, and I'll give you a minute to read it, because I think it perfectly encapsulates his dilemma. So please read. Thanks, Malcolm. Thank you. Next slide. So in 1982, the establishment of Nuclear Industry Radioactive Waste Executive, NIREX, which later became UK NIREX in 1985 and was then taken into public ownership. Its objective was to advise organisations and companies that produce radioactive waste on how they should package it. To set standards for radioactive waste packaging. It monitored the process of organisations and companies to check, for example, that they had procedures for keeping adequate records, to produce on behalf of the UK Departments of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs an updated public record of the quantities and types of radioactive waste in the UK, to continue to develop understanding of the scientific, technological, and environmental options for dealing with radioactive waste, including developing an understanding of the requirements for public acceptability. At that time, 60% of the UK's radioactive waste industry was stored at Sellafield. That's now well above 75% currently. Next slide, Malcolm, please. During the mid-1980s, NIREX proposals for low-level nuclear waste repositories were submitted, 4 locations on the map. All were met with strong local opposition, sometimes violent, with demonstrations covered on national television. All were abandoned due to strong local opposition. And I think that demonstrates really, can you just go back one slide, Malcolm, please? And I think that just demonstrates at that time, the failure to engage with local communities. It's also worth noting that in none of those communities were there what could be said nuclear facilities. So nobody in those areas were familiar with how the nuclear industry operated, what it was all about, etc. So basically they were going into areas where they thought they had a good understanding of the geology, basically Oxford clay, and they didn't have an engagement with the people. It was just done on the old policy of decide, announce, and defend. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So work began in 1989. After that was abandoned, work began on 2 possible sites to take both intermediate and low-level waste near Dounreay in Caithness and near Sellafield in Cumbria. Following preliminary investigations at both sites, NIREX announced plans in October 1992 to build a rock characterization facility at Sellafield. NIREX's critics, including Cumbria County Council, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, argued that the RCF was an integral part of NIREX's repository plans and in effect a Trojan horse for intended nuclear waste repository. It was successfully argued that the RCF proposal was scientifically flawed and that NIREX's scientific knowledge was insufficient to prove that disposal was safe for any site. In 1997, following a 5-month local planning inquiry, the Secretary of State for the Environment rejected NIREX's case. Among the reasons specific to the inspector's rejection was NIREX's poor understanding of the geology and hydrology of its proposed site. Next slide, Malcolm, please. 2004, the UK Energy Act, formation of the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which is what we have today. Their objectives were to eliminate site hazards and develop waste solutions, ensure the highest standards in safety, security and environmental management, build an effective world-class industry, gain full approval and support from stakeholders, employees, contractors, government, local communities and the general public. One can argue that they're still on with doing that. Make the best use of assets and maximize value for money. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So responsibility for nuclear operating sites was restructured into 5 site licensed private companies, parent body organizations known as PBOs. Nuclear Management Partners managed Sellafield at that time. 2015, Nuclear Management Partners lose the £9 billion contract to manage Sellafield. In 2013, the Critical Public Accounts Committee report stated that the private consortium managing Sellafield has failed to reduce costs and delays. Between 2005 and 2013, the annual cost of operating Sellafield increased from 900 million to about 1.6 billion. The estimated lifetime undiscounted cost of dealing with the Sellafield site increased to 67.5 billion. 2016, Sellafield, now under direct NDA management, and set up Radioactive Waste Management, RWM Limited, which we now know as NWS since it changed its name last year, with direct responsibility for finding a geological disposal facility. So one of the things that the Public Accounts Committee found was that hazardous radioactive waste is housed in buildings which pose intolerable risk to people and the environment. It wouldn't have come to that conclusion lightly. Next slide, Malcolm, please. The history of government's attempts to bury nuclear waste has been at best opaque and at worst deeply troubling. As recently as 2004, it advocated grooming local politicians. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So you can see here, this was in response to a Freedom of Information request. There will be a need to push government into action. A positive CORIM report does not mean that the government will act. Although armed with a CORIM report, they will still be facing the same problems and lobby groups that they face today. NIMBY, anti-NIREX, community worry, green and environmental groups, etc. So in any event, there must be in place a process of preparation for the target groups: government, parliament, general public and communities, NIMBY areas. This process must be put in place now, and notice the emphasis on now. It can be high profile, but must consist of a number of elements implemented in a sensitive and appropriate way. We have to be sure that opinion leaders are carefully recruited and groomed. Now, I think there is a general understanding that that did happen, and I'll go on to talk about that in a little detail at the end of the presentation, as to how it may relate to what's happening today. Next slide, Malcolm. So this is the MP at that time, Jamie Reid, in 2006. This was a letter that was published in the Whitehaven News, where the MP adds that, if you note here in the red box, as long as I have anything to do with it, NIREX will never dig another sod of turf in West Cumbria. Quite interesting, really, since Jamie Reid is now employed in a communications role, I believe, at Sellafield. Well, so he works for the NDA currently. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So what he said in the House of Commons in 2006 was the experience of NIREX endured by my community in the mid-1990s was so wretched that I was minded to entitle this debate Fear and Loathing. So in 6th of January 2017, Jamie Reid announced he'd be stepping down from his position as an MP for Copeland in West Cumbria to work at Sellafield, which is operated by Sellafield Limited, but owned by the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So it's quite a volte-face, really, on his position 10 years previous to that. Next slide, Malcolm. So in 2008-13, there was a process known as managing radioactive waste safely, or otherwise AKA the MRWS process. It relied upon a volunteerism community partnership approach, identifying types of community: a host community, the community in which a facility will be built. This will be a small geographical area, and include the population of that area and the owners of the land. For example, it could be a town or a village. Decision-making body, the local government decision-making authority for that host community. Wider local interests, other communities that have an interest in whether or not a facility should be built in the host community, such as the next village, a neighbouring district, or a community on the local transport routes to the host community. Next slide, Malcolm. So the key features of the MRWS process were firstly an expression of interest, then a decision to participate, and all communities had a right of withdrawal, and an engagement package which covered the costs of the local communities participating in the process. So you got initial discussions, a working group, a community partnership, then you moved on to site characterization, a test of public support and the right of withdrawal. We only ever really got to a community partnership. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So the benefits package was largely undefined, but it included improved local training, skills development, education, investment, increased business for local service industries, improve public services, infrastructure, housing, recreational facilities, improved transport infrastructure, better local healthcare to meet increased needs of the community, and local environmental improvement. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So this was a 6-stage process with decision points. So an invitation issued and expressions of interest, as I've already talked about. Consistently applied subsurface unsuitability. So basically the geologist would have a look at the area and advise if the community, although it had expressed some interest, was unsuitable because of the geology. So then 3, a community consideration leading to a decision to participate, test of local support, consultation responses and a telephone poll. Then it would go on to desk-based studies in participating areas, then followed by service investigations on the remaining candidates and underground operations finally, which would then lead to construction. Next slide, Malcolm. So the 3 participating key decision-making bodies were Copeland District Council, in which Sutherfield is situated, Allerdale District Council, which is to the north of Copeland, as you can see on the map, and Cumbria County Council, which is the higher tier local authority for planning, which encompassed both Allerdale, Copeland, and Carlisle, Eden, and South Lakeland. Note that within South Lakeland, Eden, Allerdale and Copeland, the Lake District National Park is also present geographically. Next slide, Malcolm, please. But interestingly, the Lake District National Park, which is a World Heritage Site, was excluded from the decision-making body. So we still don't know why that was the case. They did, however, have a voice on the partnership, but in the final analysis, their opposition or to be in favor of a geological disposal facility wasn't to be counted in any event. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So the closing date for submissions of responses was the 10th of June 2013. So Emeritus Professor David Smythe, who was also the lead geophysicist for NIREX at Longlands Farm, noted, "We have no doubt that the IGS, now the British Geological Survey, BGS, must do the work, but in such a way that they retain their independence of judgment. It is precisely this independence of judgment that has demonstrably been lost by the BGS in recent years. While it is difficult to avoid using the British Geological Survey in future, it is clear that the BGS findings in any future national or regional site search must be subject to transparent and outside scrutiny. In addition, the terms of reference for the BGS work must not be unduly constrained. Sweden and Canada each provide funding for genuinely independent review and scrutiny of nuclear waste disposal plans. In the UK, concerted and thoughtful opposition, which is distinct from mere NIMBYism, is being provided pro bono. I can't see the site by scientists. I imagine it says by independent specialists, as is the case with his own work, or by the NGOs. Instead, some £3 million of public money has gone to PR agencies in an unsuccessful attempt to soften up the population of West Cumbria. And then he makes the point, if the UK government has nothing to fear, then it should set up an independent review agency, following the example of the Swedish NGO Office for Nuclear Waste Review, MKG. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So MRWS conducted a geological screening exercise limited to West Cumbria at stage 2 of the process. Unfortunately, the way this screening exercise was conducted was an example of the dishonesty and lack of transparency which blighted much of the MRWS process. A draft screening report was finalised in July 2010 by the BGS. However, it reached a conclusion which was a long way from DEC's desired outcome, DEC being the administrative or government authority that was overseeing the process at the time, in that it effectively ruled out those parts of the borough of Allerdale which are outside the national park. The logical consequence of this, assuming that Allerdale wouldn't support a geological disposal facility within the Lake District, would be for Allerdale to withdraw from the process, leaving only Copeland. Rather than accept and publish this report as planned, a decision was taken behind closed doors to ask the BGS to amend the screening report to a version which suited DEC's plan. This was politics taking precedence over science. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So in October 2010, a new version of the screening report was published, and this time an area of northern Allerdale close to Sillars, large enough for a GDF, was no longer excluded. The draft version was suppressed and all requests to see the draft report were refused. Fortunately, someone within the BGS decided that they could not go along with this behaviour and leaked the draft report, which is how we discovered the scale of the manipulation which had taken place. So at that time, I wrote to the chair of CORIM, Robert Pickard, asking him why he should put volunteerism before geology. And the response I got was pretty much a nothing response, really. It could be argued that the British process has also screened out unsuitable geology before asking communities to volunteer. So, as it happened, we had screened out the unsuitable geology. It's just that Robert Pickard didn't pick up on the point that the initial draft report had been manipulated. Next slide. So we return to the old Paul Nyrex investigated geology, the failure to exclude the national park, later to become a World Heritage Site. No impartial oversight, consultation responses being counted after submission cutoff dates. Incidentally, I received an anonymous phone call from somebody in the Sellafield canteen who had told me that I think about 350 consultation forms, which should have had yes or no, and then a reason for their answer, were received 4 days after the cutoff date by the supposedly independent adjudicators. There were no reasonings given in all of those responses. And later, when I pointed this out in the local press, the leader of the council at that time then argued that people didn't have to know what they were voting about to agree about something. I didn't even bother to respond to that, to be honest with you, but there we are. So we had no impartial oversight, strong local opposition, a poor test of local support. There was a telephone poll, but the way the questions were asked and the types and the way the questions were asked could really only lead to to people giving one answer, which I found very disturbing, really. There was no referendum and no impartial scrutiny of the sites. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So in order to advance beyond stage 3, to advance to stage 3, the desk-based studies, government had agreed all 3 decision-making bodies would have to agree before proceeding. So on the day of the decision, Copeland District Council said yes. Allerdale District Council would say yes if Cumbria County Council say yes. The leader of the council at that time, Eddie Martin, who subsequently asked me to step in and set up Cumbria Trust. Well, we all did it. I'm sorry about this. I'll just turn my phone off. So Cumbria County Council gave 11 reasons as to why it could not agree to proceed. I'm sorry, I'm just in the call. Sorry about that. Bye-bye. So it gave 11 reasons why it would not proceed. Following the rejection by Cumbria County Council, the Minister of State, Ed Davey, at that time, he's now leader of the Liberal Democrats, issued a statement saying that Cumbria would no longer be considered for a GDF. But we knew differently, really. So following on from that, against this troubling background of the suppression of the BGS July 2010 report, Cumbria Trust nevertheless welcomed the 2014 National Geological Screening Exercise, but we had significant reservations about this. So the BGS would be asked to provide the mapping, while the narrative would come from Radioactive Waste Management, the developer of the GDF project, a clear conflict of interest. Cumbria Trust also raised this conflict of interest with the independent review panel. 2 members of the panel supported our view that RWM's role in providing the narrative may be inadvisable due to its conflict of interest, and that it could leave open the possibility of perceived or actual manipulation. I'll make no comment on that. So the National Geological Screening Exercise continued. By designing this screening report to attract volunteers, RWM have failed in a number of areas. Any council or area which was predisposed to volunteering will probably take encouragement from the report covering their area, given that the only real screening criterion applied is the presence of 1 of 3 common rock types, meaning that virtually anywhere is considered to have suitable geology. Any council or area which is looking at this more objectively, perhaps for the first time, will struggle to make use of these reports, since the lack of information on relative suitability limits their value. If the end result is only that the same volunteers come forward once again, this exercise will have been an abject failure. We note that during the MRWS process, the presence of certain minerals, coal, oil, gas, and some metal ores were considered to pose sufficient risk that a future society may inadvertently damage a GDF in the process of exploration, that these areas were excluded from the GDF siting process. Similarly, the presence of aquifers and shallow permeable formations were also exclusion criteria. Next slide, Malcolm, please. The new screening report removes these exclusions and therefore increases the risk of future intrusion. In the view of Cumbria Trust, this is a very short-sighted approach and poses a significant risk to the long-term integrity of the GDF. One key factor in assessing commercial viability is commodity price. The higher the price, the more likely it is that extraction can be carried out commercially. So to base an assessment of future intrusion risk on commercial viability at today's commodity price is not sensible. We can't reliably predict commodity prices a year from now, so we have absolutely no way of knowing where they will be over the lifespan of a GDF. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So Sweden, this is a comparison with Sweden. The siting work began more than 30 years ago with the acquisition of knowledge on the Swedish bedrock and what properties the rock must have in order for the final repository to be safe. SKB conducted a feasibility studies in 8 municipalities between 1993 and 2000. Site investigations were initiated in 2002 and continued for about 5 years in Forsmark and Östermalm municipality and in Lexmar Simfer. I'm sorry, Johan, I've got a problem in pronouncing these, but the text is there. In 2009, a systematic comparison of the conditions of the site showed that all things considered, Forsmark is a site that offers the best prospects for achieving long-term safety. SKB therefore decided to submit license applications for a final repository located in Forsmark. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So where we are now, white paper 2018, is it MRWS2? Copeland volunteers again, but only if the Lake District National Park is excluded. It seems that the radioactive waste management must have taken on board the consideration that with the Lake District being a World Heritage Site, it might not be a good thing to begin investigations under the Lake District National Park. But interestingly, a large offshore area could now be investigated. This is quite interesting, really, because the two scientists professors of geology who were opposed to any site investigations on land thought that there could well be a good volume of suitable rock offshore. So from a geological perspective, this is quite interesting. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So the good points are there's no subsurface investigations within the national park. There could be good containment geology offshore. Significant additional investment package is promised, but we don't actually know what that significant additional investment package might be, how much it is, who will get it, what it will be spent on, and so on and so forth. It's just a promise. So RWM will work with the community partnership to identify a community vision and what this might mean for the significant additional investment package. We still don't know. So the bad points, legislation is now framed so that Cumbria County Council, who, if you remember in the MRWS process, permission from them was necessary for the process to proceed to stage 3. So now it cannot object and bring a halt to further investigations as it did with the MRWS process. The process for working with communities legislation is that one person can volunteer a community, whether he or she is a landowner or not. But the local authority, in this case Copeland, has to agree. I'll come on to Copeland in a moment because it no longer exists. So it's very difficult to pull out from the process until a test of public support. Could be 20 years with hundreds of millions of pounds already spent. The observation I make here is very simple, really. Would it be in the interest of government, having spent hundreds of millions of pounds potentially with site investigations, to have a community pull out, even though it says it could in law? My argument would be that the law would simply be changed to allow the community not to pull out. All members of the community partnership have to agree a test of public support. There is no guaranteed referendum. It could, like the last time, just be a telephone poll. no right for local concerned civil society organisations to join the community partnerships. Terms of reference are such that the only scientific references will be learned societies such as the British Geological Survey, already proven to be influenced by the developer. Therefore, no impartial independent oversight, e.g. as recommended by the outcome of the Horizon 2020 Scitex 2 project. No guarantee a community vision will be implemented. No guarantee government won't change its mind and enforce siting against the will of the community. This, the government say it is committed to making the volunteerist partnership approach work, but if the volunteerist approach fails, it will seek alternative ways to implement a solution. No prizes for guessing what alternative ways might be. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So, why did Cumbria County Council reject the MRWS process continuing? Amongst the reasons were poor geology as detailed by the two professors of geoscience concerning the onshore geology, lack of any guarantee concerning future investment, such as a sovereign wealth fund, economic dependency of West Cumbria on the nuclear industry, lack of truly independent oversight, extreme poverty in some local areas with more affluent areas. So you've got affluent areas in Copeland, which are living pretty much next door to areas of extreme poverty. Poor local transport infrastructure. So we've now got two elephants in a room: continued surface storage, which is unsustainable, too many risks, as was previously identified and explained by the Public Accounts Committee. Rising sea levels due to climate change. Climate science indicates that we should expect a 1 metre sea level rise before 2100, but to plan for a 3 metre rise. Next slide, Malcolm, please. So towards social justice for a selected siting community in West Cumbria, geological investigations should begin as soon as practically possible to determine if a site can be viable when a community has volunteered. To address the concerns raised by Cumbria County Council in 2013 when rejecting proceeding with the MRWS, a ratchet investment mechanism should be implemented to enable the selected siting community to secure the significant long-term investment promised but not guaranteed in the Working with Communities white paper, basically a contractual agreement, and the establishment of a truly independent oversight body properly resourced to run it until the facility is closed. So what I came up with if you like, an integrated economic development plan, which would look at, if the geology was right, what could the community in West Cumbria expect with reference to significant additional investment. And it turns out that people have already looked at this, and there is the possibility of a Morecambe Bay and Duddon Estuary power generation and transport barrage, which would generate, it's not actually 6 gigawatts, it's actually 3.8 gigawatts. I've since done some research on this and come to the accurate figures. And those are given by Professor George Adidas at Lancaster University, who has studied this for the past 15 years. So what you would have is a power generation capacity equal to a Hinkley Point C power station and a vastly improved transport infrastructure. You would also get revenue streams from the barrage power generation, which could be used to, or some of it anyway, build up a sovereign wealth fund for future generations. The two communities in Sweden have a guaranteed financial resource of $312 million based on current UK inventory, dollars per becquerel, and the equivalent sum would be in the order of 15 to 18 billion pounds. Community reduction on energy costs for residents and businesses to encourage further inward investment and eliminate fuel poverty, free provision of household insulation and solar generation battery storage technology to eliminate fuel poverty, and benefit of providing coastline protection against rising sea levels for the lifetime of the barrage, 120 years, which you will note is twice as long as a modern nuclear power plant's lifetime. And the establishment of a university department for long-term research into research on nuclear waste, biophysics, health and biodiversity and material science. The majority of the funding for the barrages could be sought by large infrastructure investors such as pension funds. Next slide, Malcolm, please. And I think that's the end. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Colin. I'm seeing already a comment from Johan in the chat.
Has anybody any questions for me on the detail of the presentation I've just given?
Well, Colin, what is the situation at the moment,
right,
regarding the community's interest in continuing with the present process? Do you know?
Well, what's happened at the moment is the industry has set up these community partnerships where any individual can volunteer an area, and so long as the local authority agree that they wish to participate, then a community partnership is formed. There are currently 3 community partnerships in West Cumbria and 1 in Lincolnshire, off the East Coast. I'll not come to Lincolnshire for the moment, but the 3 in West Cumbria are all funded by the RWM industry and all have quite naturally a representative from NWS on the community partnership. They are chaired by independent people, and there are other local communities, community organizations which are invited onto the partnerships. Now, mainly those are locally elected representatives through the democratic process, like parish councils or district councils. But interestingly, NGOs which are local have not yet been invited onto the partnerships. Now, one may argue quite successfully that the membership of some of these NGOs locally, certainly in our case, have got more members than some of the parish councillors attract votes. So, you know, when people ask the question, who is civil society, it's not just the locally elected officials who incidentally are usually left or right leading. That's how politics works in this country. But also you could argue that people who have both left and right leaning views nationally could and are also members of NGOs. So to try and frame it, to try and frame the legitimacy of public engagement simply by saying that, well, that person is an elected representative on a parish or a district council is, to my mind, a nonsense, because we're not dealing with RWM, radioactive waste management should not be politicized. It's a matter of science and the environment. So that's my take on it anyway. So I think that to have people on a partnership who say, well, we speak for Sellafield because we are elected representatives, either at the parish, district, or county level, is frankly while there is some legitimacy to it, I'm not saying there isn't. It seems to my mind perverse to exclude any other organisations which represent environmental interests rather than political ones. That's my view on that. So at the moment, while we have Cumbria Trust does have a management board member on the South Copeland partnership, she's not acting as Cumbria Trust. She's acting as the chief executive officer of Friends of the Lake District. So effectively, Cumbria Trust doesn't have any representations on the community partnerships. So that's where we are. Thanks for your input concerning what was the case in Sweden. But yes, Nadia, to your point in the chat, yes, anyone over the age of 16 can propose that a whole area will be suitable for a community partnership. Now, this is well, I don't think I really need to say anymore. That's it. So where we are now is very slightly different. Well, it's hugely different from where we were 3 months ago, in that now what is proposed by NWS is a dramatic change in policy where thousands of drums of plutonium contaminated waste, which were previously destined for a deep geological repository, it's now being argued by the RWM industry that they should be for shallow surface disposal. I and many others who responded to the consultation have some real problems with this, not least because it is all predicated on saving large amounts of money by not having to excavate large caverns hundreds of meters below the surface to store safely intermediate level waste. The excuse given by the industry is that new assay equipment has meant that they can now reclassify most of this intermediate level waste to low level waste. Now, whatever kind of assay equipment you may have, and however good it is, it still doesn't change the element plutonium or indeed C14 graphite to anything other than plutonium and C14 graphite. Presumably there was a reason in the first place why this waste was destined for deep geological disposal and now won't be. It will be interesting to see the results of the consultation process, but the likelihood is that now in a post-Brexit scenario, Britain finds itself some £40 billion a year down on tax revenues it doesn't now take from sales it doesn't now make to what is our largest trading partner, which is the EU still. So we have a situation where, simply put, we have to save vast amounts of money. And the reclassification of ILW into LLW is, to my mind, perverse. But there we are.
We have 2 questions, one from Niels and then one from Christiana.
Colin, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think that you at one point mentioned that the deep geological repository was projected to be located within the boundaries of a World Heritage Site, but that was later changed. So I would be curious to know how far from the World Heritage site will this new planned repository
Well,
be located? Because in order to be in violation of the World Heritage Convention, I don't think a repository has to be located within the boundaries of the site. If there's a substantial impact foreseen, it could also be in violation of the convention if the repository is outside the limits of the site.
it could be, Niels, but I think that it's generally accepted now that last year the NWS performed a series of seismic surveys on the offshore area. Do you remember me saying that the search area would now be extended to 22 kilometers off the coast? Well, they had a ship, they had a seismic survey ship that was running for about 6 weeks to 2 months, surveying the coastal waters of South Copeland. And I was promised by NWS's chief geologist, who's now retired, that these results would be released to the general public this spring. It turns out that the chief geologist has now retired, and the data from the seismic surveys will not now be available until next year. So in the oil and gas industry, I think it takes them about a month to interpret seismic data from which is collected by a seismic survey boat, but seemingly it must take NWS a lot longer. But there we are. So I have I do not know why this data is being retained.
But the World Heritage Site is on land. I understand.
Yes, it is. So
and the repository will also be on land. So how many kilometers?
No, that's not the case. Well, it may be the case. We don't know yet. But where we think the repository will be eventually, if there is one, because remember, Niels, if you are disposing of large volumes of intermediate level waste at or around the existing LLW our site at Drigg, then you may not even need a geological disposal facility. What you could do is, for the high level waste, the remaining high level waste, what you could do is use a deep borehole emplacement. I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking, well, what might be the way around this if the seismic data doesn't show a prospective site off the coast? In any event, you're right insofar as that there will need to be terrestrial access to the repository, so there will need to be a 1 kilometer square facility on the somewhere on the coast, so that the site.
If I may make a short intervention, in cases where a potential impact on a World Heritage site can be foreseen, the country, the host country in question is actually expected to carry out a World Heritage impact assessment. So that would be plus the environmental impact assessment, and that could be actually at the demand from impacted citizens and NGOs. But it would have to be based on a concrete assessment For instance, how close to the World Heritage site would the plan, the repository be, etc.?
Yeah, I think, Niels, that is something that the community partnerships would undertake. And I have to say, at this moment in time, I've no particular reason to believe or think that the community partnerships are acting in anything other than good faith. So I think the question, my answer to what you just described there is wait and see. So as matters progress towards the GDF, we will find out whether or not that the intention will be to do as exactly as you described. I do worry though that this new policy, this major divergence from Euratom, as it were, in order so that they may dispose of ILW in a shallow subsurface repository, will probably lead to the abandonment of a GDF and emplacement of higher activity waste, vitrified or not, into deep boreholes as that technology progresses. And it's also interesting to note that two academics who are closely linked with the RWM industry have given their support to the idea of deep borehole disposal for higher activity waste. So I'm just waiting for the next iteration of or change of policy concerning geological disposal. I think the whole pretext of this, Niels, and anyone else, is simply to save money. So we've gone from a policy of concentrate and contain to dilute and disperse, I'm afraid, simply in order to save money. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think Christiana had one.
Yeah, I have one just quick question. Thank you, Colin, so much. This was fascinating, although some of the details made my head spin, understandably. I was wondering, do you have the questions, the poll questions that were given to the local population, or could you access them if you don't?
Actually, I probably could, yes.
I'd be very interested in seeing those.
Yeah, I could, and I'll get hold of them and I'll send you
That
them.
would be great, thank you. This was really very interesting. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks, Christina.
Nadia also has a question or a remark.
Thank you very much, Colin, for this presentation. I am aware about the content as we were, writing the report. I'm just doing the answers to our reviewers, external. But anyway, what surprised me is that individual can volunteer to be a candidate.
Anybody.
Is this the case? It's really ridiculous, because in Slovenia case, when low and intermediate level waste repository was citing that it was recognized that if individual could be volunteering their territory as an owner or something like that, it could bring to a lot of problems, because perhaps the owner is volunteering the territory, but he's somewhere in United States or living around or whatever,
Well, indeed.
So this would be a very problematic boundary condition, so to say.
No, the person doesn't actually have to even live in the area that they're proposing. So you're quite right, and you're quite right that somebody in Slovenia or a group of people in Slovenia identified it as a problem, which it is.
Yeah, well, because of that, we excluded this option from the potential location for the repository. So no individual would be able to candidate to host the repository, and all the application could come only through the municipality as a legal authority representing the population there. So there should be a kind of agreement of the community that this is okay.
Well, I think it's largely down to the inability of the RWM industry to be sort of creative with how they might pursue community engagement. That's the best they could come up with, Nadia, I'm afraid, and that's written into UK government law. It's now a regulation, so it's a regulation which governs policy. So I think Tim wants to say something, if it's all right.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, congratulations, Colin. That's a very comprehensive presentation. I think the perspective, as somebody who was groomed, using the term that is in that document, I've spent most of my working life involved in this, first with the nuclear industry and then as an elected representative with particular executive responsibility for environment and nuclear issues in Cumbria. There's no doubt that this new, or relatively new policy to allow anyone to volunteer goes alongside removing Cumbria County Council as having a possible veto. So the whole thing has been designed to ensure that the process can move forward with as little opposition as possible. One of the community partnerships, for example, is effectively just 3 villages. How they can deal with a multi-billion vision strategy without independent resource and guidance, one just doesn't understand. So the whole thing is orchestrated, firstly to get the project through at all costs, but cost is extremely important because that's one of the drivers, and this new piece of legislation which is being proposed takes that even further, as Colin has mentioned. I think it's important to understand that the Copeland community, which is the main target for this because it's around Sellafield, has a population of 70,000. Sellafield provides somewhere around 20,000 direct or indirect jobs. So one of the biggest issues for politicians is the dependency aspect of that community. And because of a government policy of austerity for the last 13 years, local authorities are stripped of cash. And the combination of those things makes economic and financial priorities most important in people's minds. Therefore, persuasion and opinion, if you look at the general public, would probably be in favor of a repository just because of what they think they might get from it. The opposition to it is effectively because the government will give no guarantees of any value whatsoever about the scale of community benefit and investment, or the veracity of scientific findings, or the way in which public opinion will be measured in relation to it. So the biggest problem is how to engage citizens, and Colin and I have been working very hard on trying to make the case for more independent capacity to help people understand and make an informed decision about this. But the entire government approach is about speed and saving money. And quite clearly, as Colin's mentioned, this new approach where potentially plutonium contaminated material is reclassified is all about saving money. So we have an uphill battle to ensure that there is a fair safe and acceptable approach to this problem. And as I say, I joined the nuclear industry when the Flowers report came out, spent 20 years in the nuclear industry, and then another nearly 20 years as an elected representative trying to deal with the nuclear industry. And so I was rejected from being involved, as Colin mentioned, from being involved in any of this process, probably because my expertise and experience is too relevant and too aggressive. But congratulations, Colin. I thought that was a superb presentation, very comprehensive, and we'll work together to take it forward with all our colleagues in Europe.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much indeed, Colin. Was indeed a great step among the different presentation with the different national case we have. So I think unless we have a question, we can end up here with also testimony from Tim.